at that time, the studios really did not have archivists. They had vault people. There was no understanding that negatives would fade. They were operating in the Dark Ages.
Welcome to Into the Archives. I'm your host, Jason Wall. This is a show where lively discussions with archivists and preservationists will happen, who will share their stories on saving film, television, and music of the 20th century. Robert Harris is one of the most renowned motion picture preservationists working today, and over the past 4 decades, he's restored some of the greatest films of the 20th century, such as Lawrence of Arabia, The Godfather, and Vertigo. He's joining us today by phone from his office in New York, and it is a huge thrill to have him on the show today. Robert, welcome to Into the Archives.
Thank you, Jason. Always nice chatting with you.
Well, thank you, Robert, for taking the time for being on our show today. Before we go into our start our conversation about your career, I'm not sure if I've ever told you this over one of our dinners throughout the years, but almost 29 years ago, I went to the opening night screening at the Plitt Theater in Century City to see the restored version of Lawrence of Arabia in 70mm. And outside of the Goldwyn Theater at the Academy, the Plitt was the finest theater in L.A., in my view. Now, I'd seen Lawrence on TV once before. It was all hacked up, pan and scan, but I was intrigued by an article that I saw in the LA Times a few weeks before about the film and the restoration. So I got a few friends together and we went to the screening on opening night, which was the 15th of February, 1989. The place was sold out. There was a line around the theater down the block through the ABC Center. It was like, 775 people. It was It was a very chilly evening, as I recall. You are correct. It was a very brisk night that February evening. Now, when I walked into the theater, I was aspiring to be a film producer, and when it was finished, I wanted to be a preservationist and save film. So your work inspired my career in restoration and preservation, and if it wasn't for that, I wouldn't be doing this show today. So this is all your fault, Robert.
Well, I apologize. Did you come up and introduce yourself that evening?
No, I did not know you were there.
No, I was there, and David Lean was there, and we had a nice crowd. You should have come up.
You know, I really should have in retrospect. That was such a life-changing experience, that screening. When that Columbia logo hit the screen, I had never seen anything so beautiful before in my life. Of course, I loved classic films at that time, still do. All but 2 of my 10 favorite films of all time were released before 1965, and of course Lawrence is one of them. And personally, for me, that was an amazing screening that night.
Well, you mentioned the Columbia logo, and during the reconstruction, that's one of the last missing pieces that we found, because it had always been rumored that there had been a very specific new Columbia logo, a painting that was photographed in 65mm, because the normal Columbia logos at that time, and as you know from your work, logos tend to be dupes of dupes of dupes in the analog world.
That's correct.
And one of the last missing pieces of the film that we were able to locate was that original Columbia logo. And the afternoon that we screened at the Academy, internally, when back in April of '88 or whatever, and we weren't quite complete, Dawn Steele shut down the studio, and we ran it at the Goldwyn, and the logo came on screen, and the studio personnel, whether for fear of Dawn or love of the studio, all began applauding, because they'd never seen a logo look like that before. Anyway, that's your logo story.
Well, it was absolutely gorgeous, Robert. Now, my inspiration for my career was Lawrence of Arabia, film in general, Singing in the Rain. Now, you grew up in the 1950s and 60s.
Correct.
A fantastic time for film. Simply amazing cinema from that period was happening.
Well, I was able to see all the road shows.
Exactly. You saw those first run.
I got to see them first run. We would dress. We had reserved seats. I had to go to various cities sometime to see them, but I saw most of them. No, the first one that I recall seeing, I think my dad took me to one of the Cinerama shows early on, and the first large format film that I saw I believe, was Around the World in 80 Days, and that was in 65 millimeter, not 70, by the way, with a interlock mag track. But I didn't know that at the time.
Well, seeing those roadshow films, some were great, and many of them were awful, but there were some great ones. But what film or films, as a young man, captured, sparked your imagination, and inspired you to have a life in the film? What were those films?
It would be probably Ben-Hur and Lawrence of Arabia.
Mm.
And after Lawrence, Tom Jones, which is an odd one, but caught my imagination. And that basically captured me. But mostly Lawrence. And I did not see Lawrence uncut, by the way, because by the time that I got to see it, which would have been early in 63, it was already the shortened version.
I guess that would be, what, the second cut for Lawrence?
Correct, the second cut, the 202-minute version, plus music.
Now, there was a third cut of Lawrence for what?
In 1970, which was, 187, I think. And at that point, it was really emasculated. And what happened with that cut was that Columbia had sold the film to ABC, and they wanted a specific cut, and David was told it's for TV only, and he went in with Ann and Coates and did a shorter version, and then they made 35 millimeter prints of that version. But they actually cut the camera negative every time, and the separations.
Oh, man. Well, let's get into the restoration of Lawrence in just a moment. I'd like to talk about your early years, and one interesting tidbit that I read a long time ago that has always stuck with me. As a young boy, you said that you wanted to be a detective or an archaeologist. In many ways, you did become that in film restoration. So what was the inspiration as a young boy to consider those occupations as a career?
I have always had a thing for digging and researching, and one of the things that always interested me was archaeology. And had I not gone into the area that I'm in, to use improper grammar, I probably would have been an archaeologist just for fun.
What was your first job in the industry?
My first job in the industry was as a messenger at a company called 7 Arts in New York City. And I think I was 15 probably at that point. And I basically spent most of my summers there while all of my friends were at the beach.
Well, now, after working all your summers at 7 Arts, you went to NYU to study film, and after college, you formed a 16-millimeter distribution company called Image Motion Pictures. Now, what year would this be, Robert?
That began in 1974, and what I was trying to do was to create a syllabus for high school and college film courses for kind of one-stop shopping. We were less into entertainment films. For that, you had Films Incorporated and Swank and Twyman, who had contracts with all the studios. And what we were trying to do was to, make the Lumiere films and Great Train Robbery and Birth of a Nation and, those films available. And, we did sublicense some films, especially from Columbia. But those were mostly also films that had some cinematic import. They were less for entertainment and more for entertainment study.
Now, sometime in the mid-1970s, you acquired the American rights to Bonaparte and the Revolution, which would be either the 18th or 19th version of Napoleon. So how did that all happen? How did you acquire those rights?
I was looking for French films. French cinema is a wonderful place to learn about film. And I was in Paris, I think in February of 1975, and I was able to acquire a handful of the Abel Gance films, and we put together an agreement on the Marcel Pagnol films, and I got to spend some time with René Clair. So we licensed some interesting films, but the one that caught my imagination was always Napoleon, because as a kid, and I'm forgetting the name of the book, it was in the Citadel series, I believe, of the great films, and there was a wonderful chapter on Napoleon and polyvision and how the screen opened up into this huge size at the end of the film, and that caught my imagination. I licensed Bonaparte and the Revolution basically with the proviso that if we were able to acquire elements on Napoleon, that we would be able to do something with Napoleon. And concurrently, Kevin Brownlow had been reconstructing Napoleon. But it was 4 years until, he had something that we were able to run in Telluride. And things took off after that.
Well, yes, they did. Between 1979 to 1982, it was really a great era for the film Napoleon. You had, of course, those film festival screenings, and then you had all those wonderful special screenings at Radio City Music Hall and the Shrine Auditorium in Los Angeles.
Well, it actually goes back to the, I think, Pacific Film Archive. There was an earlier cut, incomplete, that was run when I believe Tom Luddy was running the archive back around 1975, and I believe Francis Coppola saw it then. We acquired the rights soon after that. We ran a not quite complete version in, I think it was March of 1980. No, I'm sorry, March of 1980 in Minneapolis at the Walker Arts Center. And Abel flew in, and Abel was able to sit down with Carmine Coppola and go over music, and we discussed cutting at that time because we knew that wherever we opened, we were not going to be able to run the long version. And when we opened at Radio City, it became obvious that we were not even going to be able to run the version that we had intended to run and would be forced to run it at 24 frames a second.
And what was the reasoning for that?
Because you go into triple plutonium overtime. And the concept was to be able to do the show and not lose money. And we still lost money in a number of cities, but it was fun doing it.
Now, I believe the start of your preservation restoration career actually happened before Napoleon with a handful of titles, correct?
It is. I did some early tinkering with Lang's M early on because the domestic cut had been shortened, and I was able to acquire the original ending with the jury, and I cut that back together, albeit in 16 millimeter. And then reconstructed the 1938 J'accuse back to the original version from materials courtesy of the Museum of Modern Art and some other institutions, because the only element that we were able to bring over was a fine-grained master, which is a duplicating positive from which you make two printing negatives, and that was from the reissue version, which really didn't work that well. And then we did the same thing with Grand Amour de Beethoven. That I had discussed with Abel in Telluride to get the version that he was looking for.
Now, as you were doing these restorations, you co-wrote a book in 1976 called The Films of Alfred Hitchcock. So how did this book come about, and how long did the research and writing take?
Well, it took probably upwards of 2 weeks. No, we actually, Mike Lasky and I worked on it for probably 6 months, and I had a little screening room in the attic of my parents' home where I would screen everything in 16 millimeter. It was just an interesting project because I loved Alfred Hitchcock's films.
Now, at this time, writing this book, there were 5 films from Hitchcock locked away in purgatory, if you will. Did you have any sort of access to those films during the writing?
Yes. No, I did have access, and I was able, through collectors, to borrow prints on all of them, and I was able to run them in 16 millimeter. As you know, Jim Katz was the one who brought the Hitchcock films into Universal and basically put his job on the line by doing so. And I think he paid, the license on them was $5 million, and they brought in like $35 million. Wow. And he proved through the Classics division that these films had an extended life, and it wasn't just on the wonders of VHS.
Well, thinking about that period of time between 1983 and 1984, the concept of film preservation itself hit my radar thanks to those 5 Hitchcocks that were reissued by Universal. Of course, film preservation had been around for years, and MoMA, UCLA, BFI, the George Eastman House, AFI, and others But with the return of Napoleon, those 5 Hitchcocks, which featured Rear Window, Vertigo, Man Who Knew Too Much, the 56 remake, Trouble with Harry, Rope, Ron Havar's work on the 1954 musical A Star is Born, the fantastic Bob Gitt and his restoration of Frank Capra's Lost Horizon, which I believe Columbia did take out in a reissue in the theaters at that time, along with home video sales growing and exploding. Did the studios truly start to change their approach on preserving their libraries due to the recent high-profile restorations and reissues that were making good money for them, or were they still just operating in the dark ages?
They were operating in the dark ages. At that time, the studios really did not have archivists. They had vault people. And the feeling was that if you owned intellectual property, you had your camera negative, and it was locked away, and it was fine. And they didn't realize that when films had been recut, that pieces had been thrown away and normally not kept, and the protection elements had been junked when pieces were taken out of them. At least the pieces were junked. There was product. There was no understanding that negatives would fade. There was no understanding that you needed to cool things, control temperature and humidity. When my assistant Joanne Lawson and I went to visit the original camera negative on Lawrence back in late 1986, and we discovered that it had been cut not twice but 3 times. It was in I believe it was converted bowling alley under the flight path of JFK, the airport. Temperature was around 68 degrees, and Lawrence was sitting there in old, bent, rusted cans. We finished the film in 88. That 88-89 period, when the studios suddenly woke up and said, wait a minute, might we have a problem? And that's when I believe Grover Crisp joined Columbia, and really the situation even at Fox, I don't think really began until Sean Belston went into his new job there. That was the beginning, really.
The genesis of the restoration of Lawrence of Arabia, how did that come about at Columbia?
It came about because I realized it was my favorite film, and I had never seen the original Roadshow version, which was 222 minutes without music, 232 approximately with overture, entr'acte, exit music, intermission. And I had been working with a gentleman named Dennis Doff, who was heading up the non-theatrical division at Columbia. So I began with him. He went to the powers that be because this kind of fell under his division, and he made arrangements for me to go visit the camera negative. And it was the studio's feeling that the camera negative had never been touched. It was perfect. It was the original version of the film. They were wrong. And that began this, literally a 2.5-year odyssey that really got things rolling, I guess.
When you first benched the camera negative for Lawrence of Arabia, as well as the audio tracks, what sort of shape was it in back in 86, 87?
Well, the camera negative had been cut in what's called single-strand auto-select, which means that you're running it on an optical printer, and both the negative and the print stock go back and forth so that what are called printer functions, all of your fades and dissolves, are encoded from camera negative on every print as original. So, for example, if you're looking at, if you have the negative on a rewind and you're looking at it, a shot will end at a dissolve, and it'll go out. The scene will go on for another, could be 3, 4, 5 seconds. You could have a tail slate, a head slate. On the next shot, you'll have some leader, and then you'll go into the next shot. And this is the way that long versions, short versions, roadshow, general release, foreign versions could have been cut. And it was normally used toward the production of only 70 millimeter prints and the production of 35 millimeter matrices, which were used for dye transfer Technicolor prints in 35 millimeter. And because of that, you would have an extraordinary amount of wear on your camera negative when making 70 millimeter prints, but minimal wear on the camera negative when making printing matrices. So Lawrence, for example, had been run about 120 times. If a theater tore up the first 20 feet of a reel and needed replacement footage, guess what? Technicolor London would put the original camera negative on a printer, and they would run off a 100-foot section from the camera negative. So the heads and the tails became very chewed up. By the time that we got our hands on the negative, tape basically holding together the edges of virtually every splice in the film where the shots are cut together. The perfs were torn throughout, at least slightly. The negative was scratched. It was cupped from heat, so it didn't print flat. It wasn't a pretty picture. And the track was equally as bad. One of the things that people may not realize is that there are language deficiencies between American and English, where we call a track negative, or a track negative in this country, is an optical track negative that's used for making 35 or 16 millimeter prints. And when I first received the inventories for the tracks, all of the elements were, except for the camera negative, were stored in the UK, where they had been sitting in a vault for, 15 or 20 years, where people could actually go in who worked at the studio and take out cans of cuts and trims and extras and daily track and run them on a flatbed or a moviola, which was odd, which was why we ended up missing some pieces. Not that people stole them, but because they just got lost over the years. What actually occurred is that in the inventory, everything was a track negative. So we realized that we didn't have mags, and at a certain point, Columbia just shipped 2,800 pounds of material to my office. In there were cans of mag, and I didn't realize the terminology until we were actually sitting at a chem at Warner Hollywood with David Lean and Ann Coates, and we're making our cuts and doing the fine cut, his director's cut of the film. And I did a diagonal cut into the track where he wanted something removed, and he said, "You're cutting my new track negative?" And it was one of those aha moments. So you call it a track negative over there. So if you're ever looking for something for elements stored in the UK, it could say mag or it could say track negative.
So you had the original negative, some audio tracks, but give us an inventory of the other material you had at your disposal.
So we actually had 65 millimeter cans of original negative, trims, extras, outs, B negative.
Okay.
Then we had the 35 millimeter parts of daily rolls, trims, track, and then there were some miscellaneous bits and pieces also at the bottom of this crate, which turned out to be FV, foreign version, which were things like the music for Auda's entrance to his camp, which was a cut sequence, which fortunately, the only thing that was missing was music. So we had 4-track on that. We had black and white, what was called slop print, optical prints made for cutting of various other sound effects and things, because everyone needed a black and white dupe. So within all these elements, you have to start inventorying and then finding what you're looking for. I had a phone call with Ann Coates early on, and she got David Lean involved, and she told me the first few things to look for, which was the logo, the tilt down to, I guess it's St. Paul's, where you have the bust of Lawrence. And as we started going through cans on a rewind, and you have pieces that would just fall off onto your bench, so we had everything lined with black velvet. Nothing was attached to anything. I'm not finding the missing pieces. For example, I would find the beginning of the track-in to the bust of Lawrence. I would find the end of that shot, but not the shot that I needed that was missing from the film that had been cut in January of 1963. And I recall getting to the end or toward the end of that roll, and I have all these little pieces falling off, and my hand is in a cotton glove, obviously, and I'm rolling through, and I hit a splice. And that's how we started discovering that the deletions had been put back in the cans with the trims and extras all as though they'd never been in the film in the first place. So that first trim was discovered with, I think, about a dozen or 14 frames of the end of the tilt down into St. Paul's, and then it went shot to shot to shot to shot, and we had the entire sequence in that situation. So it was a learning experience as to how the elements had been recanned and stored.
So when the movie was recut again in 70 or 71 for TV, and then or for the reissue, and then for the ABC TV run, did that material go in the same way, or was that scattered through the Columbia vaults?
That was, part of it was scattered. The interesting thing was that for that situation, they had put back the fireside chat. That had been removed in January of 1963, so that sequence was in the camera negative, but in the wrong place. And there were also extended sequences where they needed to, for ease, cut to something else. So there were additional dupes that were made and recut into the camera negative. So the camera negative, as it stood in 1987, did not really relate to any version of the film. And if it related to any version of the film, it would be more the 1971 than the December 62 or January 63.
Now, at one point, one of the reels, I think 2A, didn't that get flipped at some point, like in a reissue or the television version or something?
Yeah, it was either 1B or 2A. It wasn't the reissue. It got flopped when the lab made the 35 millimeter interpositive in 1966, and it stayed that way.
When the reconstruction was underway, Columbia was owned by Coca-Cola. Oscar-winning producer David Putman was running the studio. Was he involved in any way in the Lawrence project?
He was for good and bad, and I don't want to knock David Putnam. He's a wonderful producer, but we began the job in fall of 1986. The elements were delivered in January, I believe, or early February of 87, and a question came down from the studio. Basically, Mr. Putnam would like to run it in Cannes in May. Well, it wasn't happening. They shut down the restoration, and it didn't begin again until Dawn Steele arrived at the studio. And again, I don't blame David Putnam. It's a business decision, but it didn't move forward until Dawn arrived, and I didn't know her. I called Marty Scorsese and asked if he knew her, and they had apparently been friends for ages. And I said, "Listen, I need you to help. I need to get to her. Can you set up a call for me?" And he said, "No."
Oh, wow.
It was like, "No." And he said, "Listen, I'm seeing her at, I think it was Giorgio Armani's birthday party in 2 weeks." And I got a call when he got back in New York, I guess, and he said, things are going to move forward. And I said, "How did you do it?" And he said, "Well, Steven Spielberg and I were there, and we each took her by the arm, lifted her up, walked her out of the room, and said, if you don't do this, neither of us will ever make a film for Columbia again." The reality of the situation was that it was Dawn Steele who really began this whole studio ethic of reconstruction and restoration. Because had she not do that, bless her soul, there would be no Lawrence. There would probably not be the people at the studio level that are there today. And she stood by it from beginning to end. And I remember when we were making our first 65mm interpositive, and the negatives started cracking up. Every time we would do a reel, we would lose something, and I'd have to go back to the separations, which wouldn't fit together. Black and white separations, for those of your listeners that don't know, protect an Eastman color camera negative. There are 3 black and white, low contrast, fine grain positive records, and the concept was that if you put them back together, you can recreate something close to the camera negative if they're done properly, if all 3 records are produced. However, the larger the film, the more they shrink. So in the analog world, where we would go to the separations and there might be 3 camels up in the upper left-hand corner of the frame, we would have a herd of yellow, cyan, and magenta camels in the final tube negative, and there was nothing that we could do about that. I actually had to go to Dawn when things started cracking up, and I called her and I said, look, I'd like to make a second IP, just in case. And we didn't have the digital world then that we do now. And she said, how much will it cost? And I said, $65,000, $70,000. And she said, make it. And it was a couple of months after Lawrence opened that Tom Pollock from Universal picked up that mantle and allowed Spartacus to begin.
Well, let's chat about Spartacus for a moment. This is another film, like Lawrence, that had been butchered a number of times. The first time for Spartacus, I believe, were censor cuts before the film was released. They removed 5 or 6 minutes. Then the scissors came out again for the 1967 reissue, which I believe they moved, 20, 25 minutes from the film?
Well, they chopped out all the footage of Kirk on the cross, for one thing.
Yes.
It was, seriously?
Yes, exactly. It's like, what were they thinking? Now, that version is the version I would see on KTTV in Los Angeles or repertory screenings before the 1991 reissue. So that's how I knew the film. But anyway, after Lawrence, you went on to produce a couple of films, and one of them was The Grifters, which I rewatched about a year or so ago, and it holds up beautifully. But your next restoration reconstruction project was Spartacus. And so was this a project that you initiated, or did you get a call from Universal? I'm just curious how this project ended up on your film bench back in 1990, 91.
Well, I was looking for another project. There are certain films that I always found interesting for one reason or another, and the first film that came to mind, because it was very important and major film at the time, was Exodus, which was the first Super Panavision 70 film to be produced. And I was concerned about the camera negative, and I borrowed a print, and I watched it, and I watched it a second time, and I called David Lean, and I said, I'm thinking about what to do next, and I need your advice. And he said, what do you need? Oh, dear, tell me. And I said, I just watched Exodus. And he said, and what did you think? I said, it really hasn't stood the test of time. And he said, no, you're wrong. And basically he said it wasn't a good film in 1960, so pick something else. And I said, well, the other one that interests me is Spartacus. And he said, that would be a good one. Shall I call Stanley for you? And I said, that would be wonderful. He made a call to Stanley, who was okay with it, but I had not met him at that point. And the next thing was to go to Universal, and since Jim Katz had run the Classics division at Universal in the early 80s, actually he was there in 1981, and he was responsible for Universal picking up Napoleon. So that's how we met initially. So I had called Jim and said, what do you think of this? Are you interested? He said, absolutely. And he called Tom Pollock, and Tom said yes, and I got a call from Tom who said, put on your jeans and get out to the vault. Let's see what we can make of this. And that was another film where the camera negative, as always, and as you know, had been cut.
Yeah.
Separation Masters, more or less cut, and there's a story to that one. Tracks, cut, and since there were, again, at least 3 versions of the film, where are the different elements? What happened to them over the intervening decades? So, that was another search, and it took months and months and months.
Well, this is somewhat of a running issue with separation masters of that era. If the negative was cut, sometimes the separation masters would be cut to conform to the negative, or the separation masters would be born as a pre-release version with alternate takes, which I know that you ran into about 15 or so years later on The Godfather. But for Spartacus, you were saying more or less the separation masters were cut. So, were they cut to the original theatrical, the reissue, or perhaps separate reels survived in the pre-release censor version of the Separation Master? So basically a mixture of,
yes.
So a mixture of all 3. So it really depended on the reel.
What happened? It depended on the reel. It depended on the reel. I do a lot of research, and I can spend a month and a half, 2 months on research. I will get every piece of paper that I can find, the post-production records, the production records, the camera reports, everything that I can get my hands on. And you've got to read through everything, because you may go through something the first time, not realize that there's an important factoid in there until you read another piece of paper. And that then leads you back to the first set of papers, which hopefully you've marked up in some way and segregated from the paper that you don't need. And I recall it was over a weekend, and I was sitting at my hotel in L.A. with piles of paper, and I noticed something about the dates, manufacturing dates, and request dates on elements. And what it turned out was that as the camera negative was being cut from the censorship version, or the pre-censorship version, to the roadshow version, the lab, because cutting would be going on literally at Technicolor normally, the lab would come in, take a reel of camera negative, take it off to manufacture the SEPs, and return it. So some reels were one version of the film, some reels were another version of the film, and the camera negative might have an alternate take, and the original take would be in the Separation Masters, or vice versa. For example, the sequence in which Woody Strode throws a lance or a spear, whatever it was, at Laurence Olivier, and of course it was on a wire, which you don't want to see. The original version of that was that he climbed up, was going after Olivier, and Olivier slits the back of his neck. That didn't work in the post-censorship version, and you see blood spurting up onto Olivier's face. So that was cut and just replaced with something far less onerous.
Mm-hmm.
That element was in the Separation Masters, but sometimes they weren't.
Sometimes they were cut and then put into cans, I would assume.
Sometimes they were cut and gone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
period.
True.
There's a couple of sequences in a public house, and the extended death of Charles Lawton, where he says, "And when I'm dead, bring him to me and show my body to him." It's a pastiche, and I wish that we had some of the things that we would have loved to have had, but we didn't. In some cases, I was able to find audio.
Well, since you had the audio and no picture on some of these scenes, was there ever consideration ever using that audio with stills, sort of like what Ron did on A Star Is Born?
No, because it ultimately breaks the spell between the audience and the film. It really doesn't work. You can do it.
It takes you out.
It really does take you out. You can do it on a Blu-ray, for example, you want to watch the longer version, you want to hear this dialogue, great, here it is, and, here's some stills to go with it if you want to do it that way. The second time that Ron, when it was prepared for home video, he was animating the stills a little bit to try and make them a little bit more palatable. But for his specific cause on A Star is Born, you really needed to do that.
Well, let's talk about the audio on Spartacus just for a moment. We know that the picture negative was cut. The separation masters were of a different version depending on the reel. But like the picture, you would have multiple versions of the audio, as well as, I would assume, a slew of trims, audio trims. So what was the process for you and your team to identify those missing pieces and put this jigsaw puzzle back together again?
Feature film inventories.
Yeah.
Most people don't, but there were hundreds and hundreds of reels of original 6-track audio. And I would go in with Mike Hyatt, my assistant on the project, and we would listen. We would give it, 2-3 hours a day, and we would just listen to audio tracks. We had picture. I had taken the green record, the green separation record, which is the magenta information. Pacific Title had made a 35-scope work picture of that, so we knew what we had in the separation masters. And I had seen the picture, but I had no idea what the sound was. We had different versions of the screenplay, courtesy of the Douglas Collection at University of Wisconsin. So I knew basically what we were looking for, and it's like 2 o'clock in the morning, and my head is going around, and I realized, wait a minute, I heard a piece of music and a couple of lines of dialogue in a reel yesterday, which will fit with this sequence, which looks like it might work. And I came in the next morning, and Mike and I went to the sound department. We put up the reel again, and it was, yep. And that's the way that you find things. It's a lot of trial and error. Sometimes more error than trial, and sometimes you're looking for things that you can't find. For example, we went through the old card inventories, which Bob O'Neill had kept when he was at Universal. There was an annotation, TLA, Technorama Large Aperture, camera negative, Gene Simmons nude scene at pond, international version. Okay, we want this. No one could find it. So just gone.
And when the trail goes cold like this, the assumption would be the footage was ordered to be junked at some point in its life. But going back to the restoration, the negative of Spartacus was unusable, not because of the editorial cuts that happened in 1967, but because of severe fading. The film was shot on the worst era of 52-48 Kodak stock between 1958 and 1960, and the separation masters had to be used. Now, we know that they were conformed in all these funky different versions, but was all the footage that ended up in the final restoration come from those separation masters, or did you use trim footage either from OCN or print for any of the missing sections or scenes in the film?
It was separation masters. The separation masters actually had more footage than the camera negative. However, the separation masters were all shrunken. Remember when I told you about the herd of camels in Lawrence? Same situation with Spartacus. Separation masters can be quite good as far as shrinkage, unless they're acetate, which most of them are, for 4-perf 35 millimeter. But when you go to 8-perf, the shrinkage is twice as much. So what we ended up doing, and this was performed by Paul Rattan, what he had to do was to set up the separations on an optical printer. We would take I believe it was the third frame of every shot, and he made an exposure in magenta. Those were locked into a holder in the optical printer. All 3 records were then separately aligned to that print for alignment. Every shot had to be done that way, dependent upon where you wanted your focus and resolution to be most accurate. and you let it drift from there. And this was after, obviously, we ran the separations in a room with high humidity to try and get them to get back to their normal shape. But it came out looking, I thought, very, very good for the problems that were involved, and Paul did a wonderful job.
You said earlier, thanks to Sir David Lean, you had contact with Stanley Kubrick early on. So how involved did he become in this restoration? Did you need to send him footage every day or once a week to look at?
No. We would talk once every couple of weeks or as necessary and go over the problems of the day. And fortunately, he was a photographer and knew pretty much everything that there was to know. And we had a situation, if you recall, I told you that the separation masters were being produced as the negative was being recut.
Yeah.
There was one situation where the long negative went out for separation masters, and then for some reason it went back, was recut, and one of the color records was the cut version of the film. It was the slave trek across Italy, which has a lot of snow. The colors weren't working properly, and we ended up, I think, faking it as best we could by using one of the other records with a different filter and a different exposure. But I explained that to Stanley, what we were doing, and he cut me off halfway through, knowing exactly where I was going, and he said, "Why don't we make it late afternoon? So you're just going to, add this color to it, and you'll be fine." But no, he was wonderful, and we had Bob Lawrence on the project, who was the original editor. So he was with us on a daily basis to help with continuity and anything else that came up. It's interesting. People think of Stanley Kubrick and they think of this hermit living in a castle. No. We would finish up talking about the problems of the day, and he would go on to, so how are the Yankees doing? And just a good guy, brilliant.
Well, this may be heresy to say, but Spartacus is my favorite Kubrick film. I know it's not his best, but it's a film that I do revisit more than the others that he directed. And if I compare Spartacus to, say, I don't know, William Wyler's Ben-Hur, which is a film that I have deep appreciation for, it just doesn't hold up like Spartacus does. I think it's one hell of a film that Kubrick directed. I mean, he was the replacement director. I think Anthony Mann shot 3 days before he was fired and Kubrick came on. But again, it's a hell of a film.
Spartacus is more literate. You start with a Howard Fast novel. You have a screenplay that was extraordinary. Mm-hmm. And then you have, Charles Lawton and Peter Ustinov.
Yeah, they were great.
Adding things to the dialogue. And it stands the test of time.
Yes, it does. But unfortunately, Robert, we are out of time for this episode of Into the Archives, and I have a slew of questions to ask you about My Fair Lady, Vertigo, Rear Window, and the Godfather trilogy, but we will do that next week on our show, so please come on back to hear part 2 of our interview with Robert Harris. I'm Jason Wall, and we will see you next time on Into the Archives. Check out our website at www.intothearchivesshow.com. You can email us at intothearchives@yahoo.com. Into the Archives is copyrighted 2017 by Brody Productions. All rights reserved.
Distributed by National International Broadcasting.